Okay, there are two more paradigms that I want to touch upon here that reveal more things to evaluate in the area of speech and language, more things that could be contributing to any speech and language problem. One is the information processing point of view. I associate the names Osherson and Lasnik with this, although there are many names that could be associated. And this particular point of view draws our attention to interactive levels of organization that are involved in language and component processes. These components of language are nonlinear, meaning each one has its own organization, its own rule structure, as was the case in the content form use model, because content itself has its organization and rules. Phonology has its own organization and rules. Syntax, morphology, etc., and pragmatics. And each are modular, meaning they're their own subsystems that interact. They're independent on one hand, but work together on the other. Well, that's true of levels of organization, and the levels of organization I want to draw your attention to. Again, remind you, you've had this already, I know it elsewhere, are the pre-linguistic level of organization, which doesn't mean baby before speaking, but rather before any of us attach meaning to things, we must perceive, particularly in reception of language, we have to perceive phonemes, sounds, right? We have to perceive puz and buzz and tuz, because that's all we really receive when we listen to language being directed at us from others. We perceive sounds. And if we recognize those sounds as phonemes, not consciously, but our mind does, we can make out words. Then we can make out sentences. Then we can make out stories, etc., right? If this was a face-to-face section, we may do this in our synchronous meeting. I would have somebody speak a language that you're totally not, that most students are totally not fluent in, because then you'll hear, you really perceive, really recognize what language really is made up of, what your mind is really receiving. If, for example, listening to me, all you're hearing, all you're receiving is noise from me, a string of phonemes. But your mind is organizing that, is decoding that. That's a popular term, right? So that you're aware of ideas. You're not thinking about the sounds, you're not thinking about the words, you're not thinking about anything but the ideas. You're not aware, if you're following me. But if you're hearing a language that you're not fluent in, well, that's all you're thinking about is, what the heck is this noise about? You know, what's that word? Is that a word? Well, that's what perception's about. Perception's about detecting the sounds, like puz and buzz and e's and ahs and stuff like that. The high-speed processing that we're not aware of, that we learn about in the courses on speech science and acoustics. But that's part of language. That's an aspect, or that's interacts with language. That ability to perceive. That could be problematic, right? Could be contributing to a speech and language problem, perception. And sensory motor behavior, movement and sensation. That too is part of this level of organization prior to the next level, linguistic, which is the integration of meaning, symbolic system, pragmatics, through action, through the act of speaking or the act of comprehending. You're not, again, aware when you speak, typically, of the sounds you're producing, the reasons you're talking. You're not thinking about these things. You're thinking about the ideas. So the integration of content form use without thinking about talking is the linguistic level of organization. Once we start thinking about talking and about the subsystems, the content, the form, phonology, morphology, syntax, what we're doing in this course, now we're in the domain of the metalinguistics, thinking about language, another level of organization. And thinking about language enables things like recognizing and understanding figurative language. Spelling, by the way, facilitates, of course, supports reading, and requires that the individual really recognizes the difference between the meaning of something and the symbol system that stands for the thing. So that I've learned over the years that kids really don't get to this level of metalinguistic level till maybe 5 or 6. That when they, earlier on when they're coloring letters, and which I used to think of as metalinguistics, that's really, or playing with their little puzzles and stuff, that unless they recognize that those letters make up words and those words stand for things, they're not really thinking about language, they're thinking about objects like letters that are like toys. You know, they're not language until one recognizes that language represents things out there in the world. Think about that. That's metalinguistic level when that's recognized and you're thinking about language as you are in this course. And there's one other level of organization, or at least it's one that's very close to the meta-linguistic level, but it's an executive function aspect of language, and that is the use of language to regulate behavior. To essentially talk to oneself, that internal conversation we all have, that we use to direct behavior or suppress interfering behavior. Before we do this, we do that, we wait, we listen, etc. And we learn from others, don't we? We internalize procedures, cause and effect relationships, the advice we get and information we get about what's out there in the world, and we commit that stuff to memory. We then retrieve that material and use it in doing things like adding numbers, carrying numbers, doing a Bloom and Leahy assessment, or hopefully doing diagnostics where we keep in mind the information I'm trying to get you to listen to me talk about and commit to a mental model, to the construction of a mental model that you will have available to you each time you engage with the client in an assessment, in the assessment process. Following me on this? Executive function level of processing. I've posted an article by Singer and Bashir on this. You'll find that when we review standard norm referenced assessment, we'll recognize that these assessments are often focusing on executive functions. In any event, the other, I don't have a slide on this, but serving these executive functions, by the way, or these levels of organization, are component processes that information processing also reveals to us, such as what? Memory, long-term, short-term working, immediate short-term, discrimination, attention, and other processes that we recognize support language function. That information processing also reveals to us, let me add one more thing, that you can have language through multiple sensory motor systems. For example, this you pretty much have studied primarily verbal language, which is the oral components of the sensory motor system contributing to representation. But you have reading and writing, which is vision and tactile, proprioceptive, kinesthetic aspects of movement. You can have a Braille, which is a tactile language system, right? You can have sign language, right? Many different, representation across all of the sensory motor systems. Information processing brings us to that realization. More things to potentially assess. There are so many things, aren't there? So many things that contribute to language. Very overwhelming, isn't it? And still, let me end today's session with a quick overview of the Skinner-Lovaas operant position on language, which reveals even more things to assess, even more possibilities. Because Skinner and Lovaas and others like them, the operant people, the behavioral people, they make us recognize that, they help us recognize, they don't force us, they help us understand that language is an observable behavior, a physical behavior that occurs in the real world, even though I said language is about representations, not the real world. It is in the real world. And the real world is the context in which we behave, what surrounds us. And eventually verbal behavior undergoes contextual control, the context. And we recognize, therefore, that language involves verbal behavior that operates on the world, that attempts to be adaptive, that causes things to happen, requests, that commands, that comments, and that gets others to react, right? And in reacting, and it's embedded in a context in which there's antecedents, things that occur before we speak, such as someone asking us something or commenting, or there's an object out there that grabs our attention, the antecedent. Our operant verbal behaviors are followed by consequences, events following the behavior, such as, well, here I'm talking to a green dot on a computer, am I not? Well, it looks like I'm talking to you, but in reality, I'm sitting here talking to a green dot, quite frankly. And that green dot is just standing there. But if I was in the real world room, say in a real classroom, and you were sitting across from me, well, there'd be all kinds of consequences of my speaking, right? You'd be looking at me, perhaps. You'd be taking notes. I'd see your hands moving. You'd be looking at a computer. You might be texting, and I would be flipping out because that stresses me out no end. There'd be all kinds of. You might give me maybe a reward, maybe an M&M at the end if I did a decent lecture or something, or maybe, well, I'm kidding here. Follow me, consequences that could either make me continue, would have the effect of having me continue to do what I'm doing, or they might have the effect of stopping me, an extinguishing effect. Well, these are more things I could assess. I could assess on antecedents, consequences, and I can make sure I view language as an observable behavior, embedded in context. Following me? All these many things to assess. The paradigms that I've just reviewed, Luhmann, Leahy, Chomsky, the information processing and operant paradigms, reveals multiple variables that are open to assessment, that are potentially contributors to any speech-language problem that we can identify, and that can contribute to the actual, not only the problem, but to the successes as well, the speech-language successes. There are aspects of, there are variables that I'm asking you to represent as in a mental model that you hopefully will create as we move along here, that you then apply to the problem-solving experience that you have when a client appears in your clinical setting for an assessment. So, in conclusion, by the way, you can. I often think about these different paradigms in terms of paradigms that are relational in nature, like the Bloom and Leahy and Chomskyan paradigms that really focus on intrinsic organization, mind function, and what the mind brings to speech and language that needs to be assessed. It's specific to each and every modality and module of language, and I do recognize this relational organizational business is derived from genetic properties of our species, if I can say that without being too off-putting, and also experiential things we have to assess, such as characteristics of language derived from the environment, daily experiences, family, and culture. And we will continue with this next time. Thank you.